The restaurant was suffocatingly quiet, the final patrons long gone, leaving only the heavy scent of garlic and polished mahogany. Sadie gripped her coat, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the back exit. She almost made it. Then, the heavy deadbolt of the front door clicked shut with a sound like a gunshot. Hunter stepped out of the shadows of the corner booth, his tailored suit absorbing the dim ambient light. For 6 agonizing hours, he had sat there, a silent predator nursing a single glass of bourbon after hearing her frantic, whispered phone call. He didn't raise his voice, but the command cut through the empty dining room like a blade. Don't let her leave. The evening had begun with the familiar, chaotic rhythm of a Friday night dinner service. The restaurant, a high-end, dimly lit sanctuary of authentic Mediterranean cuisine tucked away in the city's financial district, was operating at maximum capacity. Sadie moved through the narrow corridors between the crowded tables with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her entire adult life trying to be invisible. She carried trays laden with steaming plates of osso buco, delicate strands of handmade tagliatelle, and crystal glasses of deep, ruby-red Barolo. The air was a thick tapestry of overlapping conversations, the clinking of expensive silverware against fine china, and the rich, intoxicating aromas of roasted garlic, reducing wine and fresh herbs. For Sadie, this chaos was a blanket. It was a place where she could simply be the girl in the crisp white apron, nameless, faceless, and entirely unremarkable. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden silence, but rather a subtle dropping of the collective baritone, a ripple of unspoken tension that washed over the dining room. Sadie felt it before she saw the cause. Standing by the maitre d's podium was Hunter. Even in a room full of wealthy, powerful individuals, he commanded an entirely different kind of gravity. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to devour the light around him, and his eyes, a cold and calculating shade of gray, scanned the room with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. He was flanked by 2 men who moved with the stiff, hyper-alert posture of seasoned security. Sadie's heart performed a painful, stuttering flutter in her chest. She recognized him instantly, not from the news, but from the whispered rumors that floated through the kitchen staff like ghost stories. Hunter was the apex predator of the city's underground, a man whose name was rarely spoken aloud without a quick glance over the shoulder. Sadie immediately averted her eyes, focusing intently on the condensation forming on the water pitcher in her hands. She quickly retreated toward the safety of the swinging kitchen doors, her mind racing. The golden rule of survival in her carefully constructed, hidden life was simple. Never draw the attention of dangerous men. She spent the next 2 hours meticulously avoiding his section, trading tables with a younger, more eager waiter who was oblivious to the quiet menace radiating from the corner booth. Hunter ate in relative silence, his movements precise and controlled, his gaze occasionally drifting over the frantic ballet of the waitstaff. Sadie felt a persistent prickle at the back of her neck, a primal instinct warning her that she was in the proximity of a wolf. But she kept her head down, her smile plastered in place, and her voice a soft, unremarkable murmur. It was during the brief lull between the main courses and the dessert service that the mistake happened. Sadie had ducked into the narrow, secluded alcove near the wine cellar to catch her breath, her feet aching, her mind momentarily drifting to the quiet apartment waiting for her. The burner phone hidden deep in the pocket of her apron vibrated violently. It was a phone that was never supposed to ring, a lifeline to a past she had desperately tried to bury. Panic flared in her chest as she pulled it out, staring at the blocked number glowing on the small screen. She checked the corridor empty and pressed the device to her ear, her breath catching in her throat. The voice on the other end was frantic, panicked, and speaking rapidly. Before Sadie could filter her thoughts, the carefully constructed walls of her American persona crumbled. Instinct overrode caution. She pressed her hand flat against the cool brick wall of the alcove and hissed into the receiver, her voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly into a rapid, deeply colloquial Italian. It wasn't the polished, lyrical Italian taught in universities or heard in tourist centers. It was the harsh, clipped dialect of a specific, notoriously insulated neighborhood in Palermo. She used archaic slang, the words flowing with desperate urgency as she tried to calm the caller, issuing sharp, precise instructions to burn the documents and leave the safe house immediately. Ascolta. Non fare niente. Brucia tutto e vai via. Ora! She snapped, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of fear and deeply ingrained authority. She closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea, completely consumed by the sudden resurrection of her old life. She ended the call, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped the cheap plastic phone. When she opened her eyes and turned around, the breath evaporated from her lungs. Standing not 10 feet away, perfectly framed by the arched entryway of the alcove, was Hunter. He wasn't looking at the wine racks. He was looking directly at her. The expression on his face was impossible to read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise, but rather a chilling, absolute stillness. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of her own frantic heartbeat echoing in her ears. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. Sadie froze, feeling exactly like a rabbit caught in the unblinking stare of a hawk. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Neither of them moved. Sadie's mind screamed at her to run, to push past him and sprint out the back door into the cold night air. But her legs refused to cooperate. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man. Hunter slowly took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The air between them was suddenly thick with an unspoken, dangerous understanding. He had heard her. He had processed the specific, highly localized dialect. He knew she wasn't just a waitress. Slowly, deliberately, Hunter lowered his glass. He gave her one final, lingering look, a look that felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, and then turned, walking back toward the dining room with slow, measured steps. Sadie stood completely still for a long time, the cold brick wall biting through the thin fabric of her blouse, her entire body trembling as the horrifying reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had slipped. After years of flawless execution, she had made a fatal error, and she had made it in front of the most dangerous man in the city. The remaining hours of Sadie's shift stretched into an agonizing, surreal eternity. Every movement felt like wading through thick, suffocating mud. She returned to the dining room floor with a tray of polished silverware, her hands trembling so violently that the forks chattered against one another, a metallic rattling that sounded to her ears like a death knell. She forced herself to breathe, adopting the familiar, subservient posture of the invisible waitress. But the illusion was shattered. She could feel his eyes on her. Hunter had returned to his corner booth. He wasn't eating anymore. He had ordered a fresh bottle of expensive red wine, and he simply sat there, watching. He didn't glare, nor did he make any overt, aggressive movements. His surveillance was far more terrifying. It was patient, casual, and utterly absolute. Every time Sadie moved from the kitchen to a table, every time she poured water or cleared a plate, she could feel the undeniable weight of his gaze tracking her across the room. It was a psychological torment that slowly chipped away at her resolve. She tried to avoid his section, but the layout of the restaurant made it impossible to completely escape his line of sight. She noticed the small details, the terrifying subtleties of his presence. His 2 bodyguards had shifted their positions. They were no longer simply guarding his table. They had subtly repositioned themselves near the primary exits. One stood near the coat check, casually observing the main doors, while the other lingered near the corridor leading to the kitchens and the rear alleyway. They weren't overtly threatening anyone, but their placement was tactical, deliberate, and deeply alarming. They were creating a net, and Sadie knew with absolute certainty that she was the fish trapped within it. Her mind raced through a frantic inventory of survival strategies. Could she slip out the window in the women's restroom? No, it was too small, barred from the outside. Could she create a distraction? Start a fire in the kitchen? Drop a tray of glassware to cause a panic? The ideas flared and died just as quickly. Any sudden movement, any break in the established routine, would immediately trigger a response from the men guarding the exits. She was trapped in plain sight, forced to continue the charade of serving food and pouring wine while her internal world collapsed into a state of sheer panic. As the clock crept toward midnight, the restaurant slowly began to empty. The loud, boisterous tables settled their tabs and drifted out into the cold night air, their laughter echoing briefly before the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. The staff began the tedious process of breaking down the dining room, flipping chairs onto tables, sweeping the hardwood floors, and polishing the bar. Through it all, Hunter remained in his booth, The manager, a usually fastidious and demanding man, seemed entirely unwilling to approach the table to ask him to leave. He simply instructed the staff to work quietly around the remaining guest, throwing nervous, sideways glances at the dark corner. Sadie's anxiety mutated into a cold, heavy dread. The fewer people there were in the room, the more exposed she felt. The protective blanket of the crowd was gone, leaving her isolated under the harsh, predatory spotlight of Hunter's attention. She retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of organizing the dry storage, hiding among the towering shelves of imported olive oil and bulk flour. She leaned against a metal rack, pressing her face into her hands, trying to control the ragged, hyperventilating gasps escaping her lips. Why was he waiting? What did he want? If he simply wanted her dead because of who she was, or because she was a witness to something, his men would have dragged her into the alley hours ago. This drawn-out, agonizing wait was deliberate. It was a test of endurance, a psychological softening before the inevitable interrogation. He was letting her stew in her own terror, letting her imagination conjure the worst possible outcomes so that when he finally made his move, she would be completely broken. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket again, staring at the blank screen. She had a sudden, desperate urge to call the number back, to beg for help, to arrange a violent extraction, but she knew it was pointless. The voice on the other end was already running, already terrified. There was no cavalry coming. She was entirely alone. She shoved the phone deep into her bag, taking a long, shuddering breath. She had survived worse than this. She had survived the night her world burned to the ground. She could survive a standoff in an empty restaurant. She splashed cold water on her face at the prep sink, smoothing down her apron and forcing her expression into a mask of blank, unreadable calm. She would not let him see her break. She walked back out into the dining room. The space was now almost entirely deserted. The ambient lighting had been turned up, the romantic dimness replaced by the harsh reality of closing time. Only a few busboys remained, wiping down the final tables near the front windows. And Hunter. He was still there. The half-empty bottle of wine sitting on the pristine white tablecloth before him. As Sadie emerged from the swinging doors, his head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a renewed, sharpened focus. The waiting period was over. The restaurant was quiet, the witnesses were gone, and the stage was finally set. Sadie felt the last remnants of her adrenaline fade, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The game of cat and mouse had ended. Now, the real confrontation would begin. She stood near the waitress station, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting for the predator to finally make his move. The final busboy clocked out, the heavy metal door of the employee entrance clanging shut behind him with a sound that reverberated through the empty kitchen. Sadie was the last staff member left on the floor, tasked with the final walkthrough and locking the register. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her movements remained slow, deliberate, and meticulously controlled. She untied her apron, folding it with precise, obsessive care before laying it over the counter of the wait station. She grabbed her worn wool coat from the back room, sliding her arms into the sleeves, her eyes fixed on the heavy brass handle of the front door. Just a few more steps. Just 50 feet of polished hardwood floor separated her from the cold, liberating air of the city street. She kept her head down, avoiding the corner booth entirely, praying to whatever deity might be listening that she could just slip away unnoticed. She walked briskly, her low heels clicking softly against the floorboards. She reached the small vestibule, her hand extending toward the polished brass handle. She could almost feel the freezing wind on her face. Then, the heavy deadbolt of the front door clicked shut with a sound like a gunshot. Sadie froze, her hand hovering inches from the handle. She didn't have to turn around to know who had done it. One of the large men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the coat check, his hand resting casually, yet terrifyingly, over the locking mechanism. He didn't look angry. His expression was completely devoid of emotion, a blank wall of impending violence. "Store's closed," the man murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Sadie slowly lowered her hand, the cold dread finally pooling in the pit of her stomach. She turned around. Hunter had stood up from his booth. He buttoned the front of his tailored jacket with slow, methodical precision, his eyes fixed firmly on her. He moved across the dining room with a terrifying, silent grace, navigating the maze of empty tables until he stood just a few feet away from her. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. Up close, she could see the faint silver scars near his jawline, the cold, calculating intelligence radiating from his gray eyes. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the commercial refrigerators in the back. He didn't raise his voice, but the command he gave cut through the empty dining room like a blade, directed at the man blocking the door. "Don't let her leave." Sadie's breath hitched. She forced her chin up, refusing to cower, masking her terror with a thin veneer of indignation. My shift is over," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I need to go home." The manager already locked the register. Hunter tilted his head slightly, studying her face as if examining a particularly interesting piece of art. He didn't respond immediately. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently grasping the back of a nearby dining chair, pulling it out with a quiet scrape against the wood floor. "Sit down," he said softly. It wasn't a request. It was a gravitational force. "I really need to go," Sadie insisted, taking a small, involuntary step backward toward the locked door. "If this is about the bill, I can call the manager back." "He lives just," I said. "Sit down," Hunter repeated, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The underlying threat suddenly visceral and immediate. Sadie looked at the man guarding the door, then back at Hunter. The illusion of choice evaporated. Her legs felt weak, the adrenaline draining from her system, leaving her exhausted and terrified. Slowly, reluctantly, she moved forward and lowered herself into the chair he had pulled out. Hunter didn't sit immediately. He paced slowly around the table, his eyes never leaving her, before finally taking the seat directly across from her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a silver lighter, placing it gently on the pristine white tablecloth between them. The metal clinked softly against the table. "You have an excellent work ethic," Hunter began, his tone conversational, almost polite. "I've been watching you for hours. You're efficient. You don't make mistakes. You blend in perfectly with the wallpaper." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, closing the distance between them. Except for about 10 seconds near the wine cellar, Sadie swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She feigned utter confusion, widening her eyes slightly. I don't understand. If I messed up an order, I'm sorry." It was a very busy night. A small, humorless smile touched the corners of Hunter's mouth. "Don't insult my intelligence, and I won't insult yours. We are far past the point of playing the terrified waitress and the angry customer." He reached out and tapped a single finger against the tabletop. "That phone call. You thought you were alone. You thought the ambient noise would cover you. I was talking to my grandmother." Sadie lied smoothly, the fabricated backstory rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "She's not well. She gets confused. I had to speak loudly." "Your grandmother," Hunter repeated flatly, in a very specific, highly localized dialect of Sicilian, a dialect that hasn't been widely spoken since the late 90s, localized to a 3-block radius in the old quarter of Palermo. His gray eyes bored into hers, stripping away her defenses. "You told whoever was on the other end of that phone to burn the documents and leave the safe house. You used a slang term for safe house that is exclusively used by the heavily armed syndicates operating out of that specific neighborhood." Sadie felt the blood drain completely from her face. Her perfectly constructed lie shattered into a million pieces. He didn't just hear the language. He understood the nuance, the history, the exact geographical origin of the words. "Who are you?" Hunter asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "A woman who moves like a ghost, speaks the language of the old country ghosts, and hides in plain sight pouring wine for bankers. Who sent you to watch me?" "No one sent me," Sadie breathed, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "I'm not watching you. I don't care about you." Hunter leaned back, steepling his fingers together. "Then you are hiding from someone else," he deduced quickly. "And tonight, your cover cracked." He looked toward the front windows, staring out into the dark, rain-slicked street. "The problem is, when a cover cracks in my proximity, I need to know exactly what kind of debris is going to fall on me. So, we are going to sit here until you tell me exactly who you are running from." and exactly what your real name is. Sadie gripped the edges of her seat, staring at the silver lighter on the table, realizing with horrifying clarity that her carefully hidden past had finally caught up to her. And it was sitting right across the table. The silence that settled over the table was suffocating, heavy with unspoken threats and the terrifying weight of inevitability. Sadie stared at the polished silver lighter, her mind racing desperately for a way out, an angle, a lie that could withstand the penetrating scrutiny of the man sitting across from her. But looking into Hunter's cold, analytical eyes, she knew deception was a luxury she could no longer afford. He wasn't a street thug to be easily tricked. He was an architect of violence, a man who built his empire on seeing through the lies of desperate people. "I have nothing to do with your world," Sadie finally said, her voice dropping the high-pitched, subservient tone of the waitress, settling into a harder, flatter register. "I am exactly what I look like. A woman trying to make rent." Hunter let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh in a different context. A woman trying to make rent doesn't instinctively check her blind spots every time she enters a room, he observed mildly. She doesn't map the exits the moment she clocks in. I watched you during the dinner rush. You never once turned your back completely to the main doors. You walk with the weight on the balls of your feet, ready to pivot. That is not the posture of a hospitality worker. That is the posture of prey that has survived the hunt. Sadie felt a chill crawl up her spine. He hadn't just been watching her, he had been dissecting her, reading the trauma embedded in her muscle memory. "What do you want?" she asked, the question laced with a bitter exhaustion. "Money? I don't have any. Information? I don't know anything about your business or your rivals. If you're going to kill me, just get it over with. Stop playing this game." Hunter didn't react to the provocation. He reached out and picked up the silver lighter, turning it slowly over his knuckles in a mesmerizing, fluid motion. "I don't want to kill you," he said quietly. "If I wanted you dead, you would already be in the trunk of a car heading toward the river. I want answers." He stopped flipping the lighter and placed it flat on the table. "That dialect," he continued, his voice taking on a strange, almost nostalgic quality. "It's practically a dead language now. The families that spoke it were either assimilated, incarcerated, or eradicated over 20 years ago during the purges. Only a very specific, very insular group of people survived that era." He leaned in closer, his gaze pinning her down. "You are too young to have been a player in those days, which means you inherited the language. You inherited the run." Sadie bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. He was getting too close. The walls she had built around her past were trembling under the precision of his logic. "I don't know what you're talking about." She lied, though the conviction had bled out of her voice. "Let me tell you a story," Hunter said, ignoring her denial. "Many years ago, there was a man in that specific neighborhood in Palermo. A stubborn, brilliant, dangerous man. He refused to bow to the new syndicates moving in. He held his ground. He spoke that exact dialect, used that exact slang. He was eventually betrayed by his own lieutenants. They burned his house to the ground in the middle of the night, wiped out his entire operation." Hunter paused, his gray eyes searching Sadie's face for any micro-expression, any twitch of recognition. Rumor had it, he had a daughter, a young girl who was supposed to be in the house that night. But her body was never found in the ashes. The syndicate spent years looking for her, terrified that she had escaped with the ledger, the book containing every dirty secret, every payoff, every hidden account her father managed. Sadie's breathing became shallow, rapid. The restaurant around her seemed to blur, the smell of garlic and floor polish replaced by the phantom scent of smoke and burning wood. She gripped her thighs under the table, her fingernails digging into her own flesh to keep herself anchored to the present. He knew. He knew the story. He knew the history. "That was a long time ago," Sadie managed to whisper, her throat constricting. "A ghost story. Ghosts have a habit of haunting the people who created them," Hunter murmured. He reached into his pocket again, slowly this time, broadcasting his movements so as not to startle her. He withdrew a small, faded photograph and slid it across the white tablecloth toward her. Sadie looked down. It was a Polaroid, cracked and yellowing at the edges. It showed a young man, barely in his 20s, standing next to an older, powerfully built man with a thick mustache. They were smiling, standing in front of a modest stone house with a backdrop of olive trees. Sadie let out a small, involuntary gasp. The older man in the photograph was her father. The man on the right, Hunter said softly, watching the devastation wash over her face, was the only man in this world who ever treated me with an ounce of respect. He taught me how to survive. He taught me the business. And he taught me the dialect. Sadie's eyes snapped up from the photo to Hunter's face. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The young man in the photograph, the teenager standing beside her father with the cold, determined eyes. It was Hunter. You, she breathed, the horror fully dawning on her. The story she had been told, the warning she had lived by her entire life. Her father's most trusted protege, the one who had supposedly sold him out to the rival families. You're the one who betrayed him. You're the one who lit the match. The atmosphere in the room instantly turned toxic. Hunter's expression hardened, the subtle warmth of nostalgia evaporating, replaced by a terrifying, deeply entrenched fury. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The interrogation was over. The collision of their shared, bloody history had finally arrived. The silence that followed Sadie's accusation was deafening, heavy with the weight of decades-old bloodshed and misplaced blame. Hunter didn't shout. He didn't reach across the table to strike her. Instead, the terrifying stillness returned to him, completely paralyzing the air in the room. His gray eyes, previously calculating, were now cold and dead, reflecting a profound, ancient anger. Is that what you believe? Hunter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet it resonated with a dangerous vibration that made the crystal glasses on the surrounding tables seem to tremble. Is that the story you've been carrying around for 15 years while pouring cheap wine for tourists? Sadie forced herself not to shrink back into the chair. The terror was overwhelming, but underneath it, a long dormant ember of rage flared to life. This was the man who had destroyed her family, the boogeyman who had forced her to live like a rat in the shadows, constantly looking over her shoulder. The adrenaline of hatred finally overpowered her fear. I know what happened. Sadie spat, her voice surprisingly steady, filled with a venom she didn't know she possessed. She dropped the carefully cultivated American accent, her words clipping with the harsh cadence of her native tongue. I was there. I was in the orchard when the cars pulled up. I saw your men. I saw the fire. You wanted his territory, and you wanted the ledger, so you burned him alive. Hunter slowly closed his eyes, taking a deep, measured breath. When he opened them, the anger had receded, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like exhaustion. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. You were a child, he said flatly. You saw chaos in the dark. You saw fire and you saw men with guns. And you assumed the narrative that made the most sense to a terrified little girl. You assumed the monster in the dark was the one closest to you. Don't patronize me, Sadie hissed, gripping the edge of the table, half ready to throw the heavy silver lighter at his face. I know who you are. You're a butcher. I am a butcher, Hunter agreed easily, offering no defense for his current life. I have done terrible things to build what I have now. I am not a good man, but I did not betray your father. He tapped a thick finger against the faded Polaroid lying between them. I loved that man. He took me out of the gutters of Palermo when I was a starving, feral animal. He fed me, he clothed me, and he gave me a purpose. I would have burned the entire city to the ground before I let a single spark touch his home. Sadie stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the manipulation. But there was only a terrifying, immovable sincerity. The absolute certainty in his voice created a sudden, dizzying dissonance in her mind. The foundation of her entire reality, the narrative that had kept her running and hiding for her entire adult life, was suddenly shifting beneath her feet. Then who? She whispered, the anger faltering, replaced by a profound, terrifying confusion. If it wasn't you, who gave the order? The people you are still running from, Hunter said quietly. The people who called you tonight. The same syndicate that realized your father was never going to bend the knee. They paid off his lieutenants, they paid off the local police, and they orchestrated the hit. I wasn't there because they sent me on a dummy run to the docks to get me out of the way. By the time I realized it was a setup, by the time I fought my way back to the house. He paused, his jaw clenching, the memory clearly still raw. The roof had already collapsed. I dug through the ashes with my bare hands looking for you. Sadie felt the air leave her lungs. She looked down at her hands, trembling violently in her lap. "No," she muttered, shaking her head, trying desperately to reject the story. "No, you're lying. You're trying to manipulate me to get the ledger. That's why you kept me here. You want the book." "I don't give a damn about the ledger," Hunter said, his voice rising in volume for the first time, a sharp crack that made Sadie flinch. "The men named in that book are either dead or irrelevant. The money is gone. I kept you here because for 15 years, I have been tearing this world apart trying to find the only piece of my mentor that survived the fire. I swore an oath to him that I would protect his blood, and I have failed every single day since." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the table before slowly pulling back. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, completely at odds with the violent aura of the man. "When I heard your voice near the wine cellar," Hunter said, his tone softening, "when I heard that specific dialect, the exact cadence your father used, I thought I was losing my mind. I thought it was a ghost. But then I watched you. I watched the way you move, the way you calculate the room. You are his daughter. Unmistakably." Sadie closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking a hot path down her cheek. The overwhelming exhaustion of running, of being alone, of carrying the crushing weight of paranoia for a decade and a half, suddenly crashed down on her. If he was telling the truth, then she had spent her life hiding from the only person who actually wanted to save her. Before she could speak, before she could even begin to process the massive paradigm shift, the heavy silence of the restaurant was shattered. The front window of the restaurant, a massive pane of thick, reinforced glass facing the street, suddenly exploded inward in a spectacular, deafening shower of jagged shards. The concussive boom of a high-powered rifle echoed through the empty dining room, followed instantly by the wet, sickening thud of a bullet tearing through flesh. Sadie screamed as the guard standing near the front door collapsed, his throat torn open in an explosion of crimson. The interrogation was abruptly over. The ghosts from the past hadn't just haunted them. They had finally caught up. The transition from suffocating psychological tension to explosive violence was instantaneous. Before Sadie's scream had fully left her throat, Hunter was moving. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the table, one massive hand grabbing Sadie by the collar of her wool coat, hauling her out of the chair with terrifying, brutal efficiency. "Down!" he roared, throwing his entire body weight against her, tackling her to the hardwood floor just as a second barrage of high-caliber gunfire ripped through the restaurant. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A terrifying, rhythmic hammering that shattered glasses, splintered the mahogany tables, and tore chunks of plaster from the walls. Sadie hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, the sharp edges of broken plates and shattered wine glasses biting through her clothes. Hunter was immediately on top of her, shielding her body with his own, his heavy, tailored jacket, reeking of expensive cologne and sudden sweat. "Crawl," he commanded, his voice a harsh, guttural bark directly in her ear. "Toward the bar. Move." Sadie's mind was entirely blank, pure animal instinct taking over. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the slicing pain in her palms as she dragged herself over the debris. Hunter moved with her, keeping low, his right hand suddenly holding a heavy, matte black pistol that seemed to have materialized out of thin air. The second guard, the one stationed near the kitchen corridor, had already drawn his weapon and was returning fire blindly through the shattered front windows. His muzzle flashes illuminated the dark, ruined dining room in brief, strobing bursts of yellow light. "Suppressing fire, Leo," Hunter shouted over the din, dragging Sadie behind the massive solid oak structure of the main bar. "There's at least 4 of them outside. Boss," Leo yelled back, ducking behind a thick structural pillar as another volley of bullets chewed through the wood above his head. "They have long guns. We're pinned." Sadie huddled tight against the back of the bar, pulling her knees to her chest, trembling uncontrollably. The air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite, pulverized drywall, and the spilled, metallic scent of blood. The beautiful, pristine restaurant had been turned into a war zone in less than 10 seconds. Hunter crouched beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically scanning the layout of the room. He checked the magazine of his pistol, slamming it back into the grip with a sharp, metallic click. He looked down at Sadie, his expression hard and entirely devoid of fear. He was completely in his element. "Who are they?" Sadie gasped, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "Are they your men? A mutiny?" "No," Hunter spat, wiping a smear of plaster dust from his face. My men don't miss the first shot. This is messy. This is aggressive. He paused, his eyes narrowing as the firing from the street briefly paused. The phone call. The burner you used. They didn't track me here tonight. They tracked you. Sadie felt a fresh wave of horror wash over her. The people I called, they wouldn't. You said you told them to burn the safe house and run. Hunter interrupted coldly. If they panicked, if they were already compromised, the people hunting you probably had the line tapped. They traced the signal. They don't care that I'm here. To them, I'm just collateral damage. They came to tie up the last loose end of your father's legacy. The reality of the situation locked into place. Sadie wasn't caught in the crossfire of Hunter's gang war. Hunter was caught in the crossfire of hers. The men outside were the ghosts her father had warned her about. The men who had burned her childhood home to the ground. We can't stay here, Hunter said, peering cautiously over the edge of the bar. The police will be here in less than 5 minutes, but these men will breach the doors in 2. If we get caught in a choke point, we're dead. He turned to look at Leo, who was actively reloading behind the pillar. Leo. The kitchen. We fall back to the cellar. Covering! Leo yelled, stepping out slightly from behind the pillar and unleashing a rapid string of fire through the shattered windows, forcing the attackers outside to duck for cover. Hunter grabbed Sadie's arm, his grip bruising. When I say go, you run toward the swinging doors. Do not stop. Do not look back. Understand? Sadie nodded frantically, her throat too dry to speak. Go! Hunter roared. Sadie pushed herself off the floor, her low heels slipping slightly on the slick, debris-covered hardwood, and sprinted toward the kitchen. The distance was only 20 feet, but it felt like miles. She heard the deafening crack of Hunter's pistol firing rapidly behind her, providing cover, followed instantly by the terrifying whiz of incoming rounds snapping past her head, burying themselves into the walls and the stainless steel surfaces of the wait station. She hit the swinging doors with her shoulder, bursting into the stark, fluorescent-lit sanctuary of the kitchen. Hunter was right behind her, violently shoving the heavy metal doors shut and locking the deadbolt. Leo backed through the door a second later, blood seeping from a grazing wound on his left shoulder, his face pale but determined. They're moving up to the windows, Leo panted, slamming a heavy prep table against the door as a makeshift barricade. They're coming in. The cellar, Hunter commanded, pointing toward the heavy steel door at the back of the kitchen. Get the door open. Now. The facade of the quiet, dangerous mafioso was gone. Hunter was now a soldier. Moving with aggressive, desperate speed, Sadie realized, with a startling clarity amid the chaos, that he was no longer interrogating her. He was actively risking his life to protect her. The man she had hated for 15 years was the only thing standing between her and a firing squad. The wine cellar beneath Il Refugio was a labyrinth of heavy oak racks and damp stone walls, completely cut off from the noise of the city above. Now, it served as a subterranean bunker. Leo slammed the heavy steel door shut, throwing the thick iron latch with a resounding clank. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, harsh shadows across the dusty bottles. Hunter leaned heavily against a wine rack, his breathing ragged. He ripped off his tailored jacket, wincing sharply. Underneath, his crisp white shirt was soaked with a spreading stain of dark blood. You're hit, Sadie said, her voice trembling. The fear of the men upstairs was momentarily eclipsed by the sight of his injury. Ricochet off the bar, Hunter grunted, pressing a hand tightly against his side. It didn't hit anything vital. Sadie knelt beside him, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before pulling the scarf from her neck. She pressed it firmly against the wound, her hands shaking as they met the warm resistance of his blood. You don't have to do that, Hunter murmured, his expression a mix of surprise and profound weariness. You still think I'm a monster. I need you to stay conscious. Sadie replied pragmatically, pressing harder. I didn't betray your father, Sadie, Hunter said softly. Hearing her real name spoken aloud in the damp, quiet cellar broke something fundamental inside her. The defensive walls she had maintained so fiercely finally collapsed. If you didn't do it, her voice cracked. Then why did everyone say you ordered the hit? Because I let them, Hunter answered, his breathing shallow but his gray eyes intensely focused. The rival syndicate wanted an excuse to eliminate me. Taking the blame made me look like a useful, ambitious traitor. It was the only way I could stay alive long enough to consolidate power and hunt down every single man who actually lit those fires. I killed them all, Sadie. He gripped her wrist with a bloody hand. Except the ones who came here tonight. They're the desperate remnants. They think finding you will give them the ledger. There is no ledger, Sadie cried softly. He burned it himself. Hunter let out a short, bitter exhale. He burned it. All this hiding over ashes. His tone softened into something incredibly vulnerable. Before the end, he gave me one final order. He told me that my only obligation in this life was to find you, to keep you safe. I've been looking for 15 years. Before Sadie could process the weight of the revelation, the heavy thudding against the ceiling suddenly intensified. Heavy boots echoed in the kitchen above them. Someone began furiously pounding on the steel door of the cellar. They found the door, Leo said grimly, raising his pistol. Hunter groaned, forcing himself up from the floor, his jaw set with absolute resolve. The gangster was gone. The protector remained. He pulled his weapon, standing shoulder to shoulder with his bodyguard. Stay behind the racks, Hunter ordered Sadie, racking the slide of his pistol. If they get through that door, I will not let them touch you. I made a promise 15 years ago, and I intend to keep it. The assault on the cellar door began with a deafening, concussive boom that shook the dust from the heavy oak beams above their heads. A shaped charge, small but highly effective, had been detonated against the locking mechanism. The thick steel door groaned, warping inward, the heavy iron hinges screaming under the immense pressure. Sadie scrambled backward, wedging herself into the narrow gap between two massive wine racks, clutching a heavy vintage bottle of Bordeaux like a club. It was a pathetic weapon against men with automatic rifles, but it was the only tactile comfort she had. She watched through the slats of the wooden racks as Hunter and Leo took up defensive positions on either side of the entrance, their weapons trained on the buckling metal. Hunter was no longer the imposing, untouchable mob boss sitting in the corner booth. He was a wounded, cornered animal, fighting not for territory or money, but for a desperately needed redemption. His white shirt was ruined, stuck to his skin with drying blood, his face a mask of cold, terrifying concentration. A second charge detonated. The locking mechanism shattered violently, pieces of shrapnel pinging off the stone walls. The heavy steel door kicked open, rebounding off the wall with a sickening metallic clang, through the haze of smoke and plaster dust. The first attacker stepped into the threshold, an assault rifle raised to his shoulder. He didn't even have time to acquire a target. Hunter fired twice in rapid succession. The sharp cracks of the pistol were deafening in the confined space. The attacker jerked backward violently, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling, before crumpling to the floor, blocking the doorway. "One down," Leo shouted, firing a suppressing volley through the doorway, forcing the remaining men in the kitchen to scramble for cover. "They can't rush us," Hunter grunted, leaning heavily against the stone wall, his breathing becoming shallower. "It's a fatal funnel. They have to come through one at a time." "They don't have to." A harsh voice echoed down the stone stairwell from the kitchen. It was spoken in the same Palermo dialect Sadie had used on the phone, thick and venomous. "We can just drop a grenade down there and let the blast wave turn your brains to jelly, Hunter. Send the girl up and we walk away." Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. The offer was a lie. She knew that instantly. They would kill her the moment she stepped into the light. But looking at Hunter, bleeding and exhausted, she felt a sudden, terrifying surge of guilt. He was dying down here because of a phone call she made. "Don't listen to him," Hunter rasped, reading the panic on her face through the wooden slats. He raised his voice, shouting back up the stairwell in the same dialect. "You don't have grenades, Marco. If you did, you would have used them upstairs instead of wasting time with breaching charges. You're out of time. The sirens are already echoing down the avenue." Hunter was bluffing, pushing the psychological pressure back onto the attackers. It was a masterclass in the very interrogation tactics he had used on Sadie just hours before. Silence stretched from the kitchen above. Hunter's bluff had landed. The attackers knew he was right. Every second they spent in the restaurant increased the probability of a massive police response. Suddenly, a cylindrical object bounced down the stone steps, clattering across the floor of the cellar. "Flashbang!" Leo screamed, turning his face to the wall and covering his ears. Hunter dove toward the object, kicking it violently away toward the back corner of the cellar just as it detonated. The explosion was blinding. A terrifying burst of white light, and a concussive wave of sound that instantly ruptured Sadie's equilibrium. The world tilted sideways, her vision washing out into a stark, ringing white. Through the disorientation, she felt rather than saw the remaining attackers surge through the doorway. The cellar erupted into chaotic, close-quarters violence. The organized shootout devolved into a brutal, desperate brawl in the dark. Sadie blinked furiously, trying to clear her vision. She saw Leo wrestling on the ground with a heavily tattooed man, struggling to control the barrel of a rifle. And she saw Hunter. He was grappling with a massive man, the leader, Marco. Hunter's side was bleeding profusely, sapping his strength. Marco drove a heavy knee into Hunter's wounded side, eliciting a sickening grunt of pain from the older man. Hunter dropped his pistol, his knees buckling under the assault. Marco stepped back, drawing a heavy combat knife, preparing to deliver the final, killing blow to the man who had hunted his faction for a decade. The instinct to hide, the instinct that had kept Sadie alive for 15 years, completely evaporated. She didn't think. She simply reacted. She lunged from behind the wine rack, gripping the heavy bottle of Bordeaux with both hands. She swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed, bringing it down in a vicious, sweeping arc directly onto the back of Marco's skull. The glass shattered with explosive force, raining dark red wine in thick shards over both men. Marco stiffened, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed onto the stone floor like a felled tree. Unconscious before he hit the ground, Hunter fell to his knees, clutching his side, gasping for air. He looked up at Sadie, who was standing over the fallen attacker, her chest heaving, the jagged neck of the broken bottle still clutched tightly in her bleeding hand. She was covered in wine and dust, her eyes wild, looking nothing like the terrified waitress she had been hours ago. A heavy, authoritative voice boomed from the top of the stairwell, cutting through the ringing in their ears. "Police! Drop your weapons! Show me your hands!" The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers were suddenly reflecting off the shattered windows upstairs, illuminating the kitchen in a harsh, strobe-lit glow. The remaining attackers who hadn't been incapacitated instantly dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender, the fight entirely drained from them. Hunter let out a long, ragged exhale, slumping against the wine rack. He looked up at Sadie, a weak, genuinely impressed smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You definitely inherited his swing," Hunter murmured, before his eyes rolled back and he finally lost consciousness. The dawn broke cold and gray, the pale light filtering through the shattered remnants of the restaurant's front windows. The street outside was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, entirely dominated by a fleet of police cruisers, ambulances, and unmarked black SUVs. The flashing lights painted the wet asphalt in rhythmic bursts of red and blue. Sadie sat on the back bumper of an open ambulance, a thick wool blanket draped heavily over her shoulders. A paramedic was carefully picking tiny shards of glass from the palms of her hands, cleaning the cuts with stinging antiseptic. She stared blankly at the ruined facade of Il Refugio, the place that had been her sanctuary and her prison for the last 3 years. It looked small now, violated and exposed. A few yards away, Hunter was sitting on a gurney, refusing to lie down while a different team of medics aggressively packed and bandaged the gunshot wound in his side. He looked pale, exhausted, and visibly older in the harsh morning light. He was surrounded by a tight ring of heavily armed men, his men, the reinforcements that had arrived just behind the police. The authorities seemed entirely willing to let his private security handle him, a testament to the immense, terrifying influence he wielded in the city. The police had questioned Sadie briefly. Hunter had apparently already laid the groundwork before he passed out in the cellar. The official story was simple: an attempted robbery by an armed gang gone horribly wrong, thwarted by the brave private security of a wealthy patron. Sadie, the terrified waitress, was merely a bystander caught in the crossfire. No mention of the Mafia, no mention of the Palermo dialect, no mention of a 15-year-old blood feud. Once the paramedic finished bandaging her hands, Sadie stood up, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. She walked slowly toward Hunter's gurney. The ring of security men parted silently for her, a sign of respect that felt entirely alien. Hunter looked up as she approached. He waved the medics away, wincing slightly as he adjusted his posture. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the heavy, unspoken weight of the night hanging in the cold morning air. The secrets were all out. The ghosts had been confronted. The police are going to process the scene for the rest of the day, Hunter said, his voice raspy, lacking its usual commanding resonance. My men will give you a ride wherever you need to go. Your apartment, a hotel, the airport, it's your choice. Sadie looked down at her bandaged hands. The men who attacked us. Marco's crew. Are there more of them? No, Hunter said with absolute finality. Marco was the last lieutenant from the old regime. With him in custody, and his muscle neutralized, the faction is completely dead. The people you were running from no longer exist. He reached into the pocket of his ruined trousers with his good hand and pulled out a small, thick envelope. Holding it out to her. What is this? Sadie asked, hesitant to take it. It's not dirty money, Hunter assured her, a faint smile touching his lips. It's a clean passport. A new identity. Legally established. And the routing numbers to an offshore account. He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. It's the money your father left behind. The money he asked me to hold for you 15 years ago. It's been sitting there, accumulating interest, waiting for you to stop running. Sadie slowly reached out and took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands. It was the physical manifestation of her freedom, the waitress persona, the constant fear, the hiding it could all end right here, on this cold street corner. You kept your promise, Sadie said softly, looking up at him. You protected his blood. It was the only decent thing I've ever done in my life, Hunter replied, looking away toward the rising sun. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore, Sadie. You can go anywhere, be anyone. You are completely free. Sadie clutched the envelope to her chest. She looked at the man she had despised for a decade and a half. The terrifying mob boss who had turned out to be her fiercest guardian. The world was rarely painted in stark black and white. It was a messy, bloody canvas of grays. Hunter was a violent, dangerous man, but in the end, he was the only one who had remained fiercely, unflinchingly loyal to her family. Thank you, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a profound, hard-won forgiveness. Hunter met her gaze one last time, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a mutual understanding born in the blood and dust of the wine cellar. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute respect. Go live your life, Hunter commanded softly, his tone holding none of the menace from the night before. Only a quiet, weary hope. Don't let them pull you back into the dark. Sadie turned and walked toward the waiting black SUV. As the heavy door closed behind her, shielding her from the cold wind, she didn't look back at the ruined restaurant or the bleeding Mafia boss. For the first time in 15 years, she looked forward, into the bright, blinding light of the morning, finally ready to step out of the shadows. The scars of the past do not define us. They merely dictate the depth of our resilience. True freedom isn't just about escaping the monsters in the dark, it's about having the courage to face the truth, even when that truth shatters everything you thought you knew. In the end, loyalty and redemption can be found in the most unexpected, dangerous places. If this story of hidden truths and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, please drop a like, share this cinematic journey with your friends, and subscribe for more immersive, emotionally charged tales. Your support keeps these stories alive.